Hi everyone, my name is Ellen Finnigan. I am the founder of Teach to the Text and the author of the Let's Read the Iliad and Let's Read the Odyssey studies at Teach to the Text. It is July 17th at 7:30 a.m. and I am going to give you my thoughts on the Odyssey movie that came out that I saw at the first showing yesterday the very first showing at 2 p.m. So I have written, as I mentioned, a study of the Odyssey. It comes with my video lectures. I like to think of them as my greatest hits lectures. I've been teaching this book to high schoolers for almost 13 years now, actually going on 14 years now. So I spent a lot of time with this book, especially in class, discussing it with my students. And so my independent text study does come with lectures. I think there's 9 lectures in there. And also it comes with online quizzes, and it comes with my study guide that I've written on Let's Read the Odyssey. So this is coming out soon. It should be available within a couple of weeks. So it is on pre-sale now. If you'd like to purchase it now, you can purchase it for a little bit of a discount. But I'm eager to talk about the movie because what I want to say is I saw the film and the book is better. Okay, that's always true, but I'm going to tell you why. So there were some things I liked about the movie. I'll save what I liked until the end, but I'm going to start off with the negative stuff about the movie because I do want to encourage you to read the book. Um, the book. If you are going to learn about the Odyssey from a teacher, don't you want to learn from a teacher whose book looks like this? Because she's read it so many times that it's literally falling apart. And I should mention too that along with my Let's Read the Odyssey text study, I have also an edition that you can buy that works with the children's Homer. So my Let's Read the Iliad text study is really for students ages 14 and up. I recommend it for freshmen in high school all the way up through 98 years old and beyond. But this is a version of the Odyssey and the Iliad that is actually for children, for younger children, like in middle school, maybe 5th grade, 6th grade. Um, so if you'd like a younger students and older students to read it together, you can purchase the course for your older students, and then you can purchase the little study guide for your middle school students, and it will help you to see the points of overlap between the simple version and the epic poem. And then you can have everyone together for joint discussions, even though they're reading books of 2 different difficulties. So anyway, I really want to encourage you to read the book. It's much better. Let me tell you why. All right, number 1, the first thing I noticed about the film when I saw it yesterday is that there was so much talking. My favorite parts of the movie, I realized about halfway through this 3-hour movie. I was like, if y'all could just stop talking, this would be a much better movie. Yeah, overall, I thought it was good enough. That's a quote by Mediocrities. It was good enough. It was okay, but there was a lot of talking, and I realized pretty quickly in why I wasn't immediately like, yes, this is going to be a great movie. I was like, why are they talking so much in the beginning? And I realized that this has to do with kind of with dialogue in movies and in stories, but mostly in movies. There are really different purposes of dialogue in a film and in a story. And if you want to know all the different purposes of dialogue, you can take my creative writing class. But one of the purposes of dialogue is exposition. And so exposition is when you're just explaining things to people. And it's kind of, good writers always use dialogue maybe a little bit for exposition, but you try to use it for exposition as little as possible. So let me give you an example. For some reason, the movie Sweet Home Alabama is on my mind, if you've ever seen it with Reese Witherspoon. So imagine Reese Witherspoon's character coming into the bar in her hometown, and she walks in, and there's these 2 characters sitting there, and they see her walking in, and they say, "Oh, look who's home. Wow, she hasn't been back in a while. What's it been, 7 years? Something like that. We haven't seen her since she moved to New York. Ooh, is Jake here tonight? Yeah, he's over there playing pool. Has she seen him yet? No. Oh, I wonder what's going to happen." And then the characters go, "Yeah, remember when they were going to get married after high school and then she just left and nobody ever knew why? And I don't think they've seen each other since," right? So this is like exposition in dialogue. It's like when the characters are basically having a conversation for the purposes of explaining things to the audience, which is kind of inherently not super interesting, right? And so I realized that in the beginning of for the first 20 or 30 minutes, it was like all exposition. all of the dialogue was just explaining things to the audience. And it occurred to me that this is because we have no cultural literacy. These are 3,000-year-old stories that formed the basis of like, you could argue that Homer was like it was like a foundation of Western civilization. Homer was the very first, the Iliad and the Odyssey were the very first stories really to ever come out of Western civilization. It was the beginning of literature because he was writing these stories down right at the beginning of human history when the Greek alphabet was being invented. The stories went back even further though to like the late Bronze Age, like probably I think we think that the Trojan War happened in like 1200 BC. Homer was writing these down around 850 BC. And then after Homer came Greek tragedy and Greek philosophy. And then, but really it was Homer that came at the beginning. And so these stories are so old, but everybody for so long like knew these stories, right? Like it, and so because we don't have that kind of cultural literacy anymore, and because people don't read them anymore and don't have this kind of classical education, I think the movie makers couldn't rely on like a basis of knowledge in their audience to be able to just tell the story. And so it occurred to me that they're actually trying to educate the audience in the beginning about the background, about who is Odysseus, what was the Trojan War, who is Agamemnon. And in the book of the Odyssey, in the actual poem, like Homer doesn't spend any time doing that. He just jumps right into the action because the audience at the time would have been very familiar with all the stories. And so it actually made me a little sad because so much of people's culture is their stories. And if you don't have your stories in common anymore, you kind of don't have a common basis. And those stories, those timeless stories, they help us to relate to other people of our time because we all know the same stories, but they also help us to relate to the people of the past, the people in the past. So we relate to them through their stories because they're our stories. So it was just kind of a sad moment in the beginning of the movie when I realized like that there is this breakdown. And we don't have the same stories anymore. And even, of course, the Christian story, which is a true story and it's truth, but it's also a story because God knows that we love stories. And so it's a story with a big beginning, a middle, and an end, although the end hasn't happened yet. But we have that story, but even that story, the Christian story is kind of in a postmodern, in a post-Christian society is sort of, receding. And so a lot of people don't even know those stories anymore. So it really was kind of a sad moment when I was like, what binds us together as a culture? What gives us our cultural identity? And it was just a sign, the fact that the movie makers felt like they had to explain so much, and it was kind of sad. And I think that made it a worse movie because they couldn't rely on the knowledge of their audience. So that was kind of the first thing that I noticed, and it's one reason to read the book, honestly, because it gives you a foothold in the culture and in your cultural inheritance. It's like this is our cultural inheritance. This is what we've been left by the great thinkers and poets and artists of the past. And don't you want to have that? Like, don't you want to have access to that? You're not going to get it through the movie, but you can get it by reading the poem, especially reading the poem with me. It's not that long. It's not that hard. It's not that bad. And it's a great story. All right, so that's the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed is that I was really disappointed. I hate to say this because I was really excited when I heard that Matt Damon was going to play Odysseus, but I was not impressed with his acting. I was like, why is Matt Damon running around in a costume on the screen? Like, that's what I had recently seen a podcast. He was on Amy Poehler's podcast, and I listened to, I love Amy Poehler. And so I listened to their conversation. And I was like, I feel like this is the same guy that was like in the podcast that I'm seeing on the screen. And, I was like, is this just me, or is he like not really acting? Like there's not a lot of emotion. There's this scene where he's walking through like the sacking of Troy and he's surrounded by all this tragedy. And it looks like the way he's walking, he's like late to work. And he's just like walking. And he has this blank expression. He's not fighting anyone. He's just like walking kind of fast, but you don't know why he's walking fast or where he's going. And a lot of the scenes when I thought there could have been so much more acting, I appreciate like the naturalness and maybe he was trying to be natural, but it just struck me as like having, it was very dry, it was very flat, and he didn't have a lot of heart. And I thought, is this because he's lost his touch? He's just not a good actor. Maybe he was never a good actor, but I think he's a good actor. So I had to start thinking about that a little bit more. And I was like, maybe it's the fact that they didn't use accents. Like they speak in such a modern way, and they even say some turns of phrase and things that are just very not ancient. So maybe that was like taking me out of the spell of the movie. But I actually saw the film with my father, and he mentioned in the car on the way home, he's like, every time they started talking, it just took me out of the spell of the movie. I couldn't, it just removed, and I was like, I felt the same way. So then I was like, maybe it was the writing, maybe it was the dialogue, and maybe it was the material that he had to work with. But I'm not sure about that either. So I started thinking more, and I realized that his acting wasn't good, maybe in part because I know the real Odysseus from reading the book so many times. This was not Odysseus. It just simply wasn't. And I think that the character of Odysseus was so off, and the character of Odysseus was not consistent. There was a lot of inconsistencies in the way they portrayed his character that I think the best of actors would have a hard time working with. I have a slight disagreement with Aristotle. Aristotle, when he wrote Poetics, believed that when it came to tragedy or story as we would think of as a story, the most important thing was plot. He thought the most important thing was plot. I disagree. Aristotle thinks the second most important thing is character, but I think the most important thing is character. So I would go toe to toe to Aristotle on that. I'd love to one day have a conversation with him. I think the most important thing is character. I think the best stories come from character. And if you don't get that character right, if your protagonist is sort of an amalgamation of things with no consistent personality or temperament or worldview, then you really can't do a good job acting because the character itself is not, you don't even know who it is. So I think that that's why Matt Damon's acting was not impressive because I don't think they did a good job of creating the character of Odysseus. And so, why was the character of Odysseus a little bit off? That relates to my third thing, which is this movie was very, very confused about the world of the movie, the world of the story. So, if you want to take the story out of ancient Greece and make it more of a modern day spin or adaptation, that's cool with me. If you want to change the supernatural in the story more to like interpret that to be a form of magic, then that's cool with me. If you want to paint the world of the gods and goddesses in the Greek imagination of the characters in the story as it was in Homer and remain consistent to that, that's cool with me. Whatever you choose to do with the supernatural element of the Odyssey is fine with me, but you have to stay consistent. And this movie did not know what to do with the supernatural. It was like the mind of the creators of the movies themselves were confused about the role of the supernatural in human life. And therefore, their own confusion kind of spilled out into the movie. And I also think it had signs of being written by a team of people who themselves may have had different ideas about the supernatural. So it was no one was on the same page. So, for example, in the opening, the very first thing that you see on the screen had something to do with magic. It said something like this was in a time of magic or something like that. So I'm like, okay, they're going to interpret all of the supernatural elements of the story like almost like a Harry Potter magic thing. Okay, I mean whatever you want to do, but then sort of that was a very thin thread in the story that only came up a few different times and was not consistent. So it's not like a modern day take explaining the supernatural as magic. In other parts of the story, the gods, or at least one god, would like literally appear in the movie to Matt Damon. That goddess was Athena. Now, Athena in the Odyssey is a bloodthirsty war goddess. Like, she's a little bit more of a guardian angel in the Odyssey than she was in the Iliad. In the Iliad, she's like a tempestuous, mutinous teenager. She just wants, she's like wants revenge on Paris, and she hates the Trojans, and she's like wants them to die. But in this one, she's a little bit less like that. She's more like a counselor to Odysseus, but she is very much a war goddess, and that did not come through in the movie at all. Like, the woman who played her was, again, totally flat, totally boring. She would just kind of appear as like some kind of like gentle listening ear, but without any advice for Odysseus and very little help. And in fact, in the Odyssey, Athena is helping Odysseus the whole time. In fact, in the real story of the Odyssey, the role of the gods are so important that it would be literally impossible for Odysseus to succeed at getting home or accomplishing what he's supposed to accomplish at home without them. It would not be possible. There are parts in the story where he would not have made it without the help of the gods. And so that is a key part of the character of Odysseus. And in the movie, even though Matt Damon's character, who was just Matt Damon in a costume, even though he had a real goddess that he believed he was seeing and speaking to, they also gave his character this element of skepticism. Like, he was basically a skeptic. And while other people were kind of depicted as being superstitious about the role of the gods, or sorry, believing in the role of the gods and their power and fear of disobeying them, he was sort of painted in many scenes as a skeptic and sort of attributing all of that to superstition. So there was just these three elements of like, well, on the one hand, there's magic, and he even sees the magic taking place because they're goddesses who perform like completely unnatural things that humans are incapable of doing, and he witnesses them with his own eyes. But then he's also a skeptic about the supernatural, and he and then at the other time he has his goddess counselor that he literally dialogues with. So, like, it was totally all over the map, and it's like, who is Odysseus in this movie? Does he believe in the gods? Does he believe that he's hallucinating when he's talking to Athena? And so that is such a key element of Odysseus in the story. He believes in the gods. Um, he sometimes doesn't always trust them because he's smart and they're untrustworthy, but he believes in them completely. And he also is very reverent. So I noticed when the first trailer came out, it said the tagline initially, like a year ago, was like, defy the gods. And from that moment, I was like, this is not going to be true to the book. Odysseus would never say that. Odysseus would never do that. It's not that Odysseus perfectly follows the will of the gods all the time. Of course he doesn't. But when he doesn't not do it out of rebelliousness. He just doesn't do it out of human weakness, like fear or confusion or ignorance or a lack of trust. It's human weakness that leads him to not follow the gods, not defiance, not rebellion. He is always sacrificing to the gods. He believes in them completely. And it is, in fact, his help from the gods that helps him succeed. And Homer knows that what he accomplishes is quite literally impossible, and he probably would never have made it without the gods. So that's what gives Odysseus so much heart in the story. That's what gives him so much sturdiness as a character, and all of that was missing in the story. But instead of just doing away with the supernatural, the writers wanted to kind of include it, but they had no consistent worldview on the part of the characters about the actual beliefs of the characters in the movie. And so mixing it up with magic in particular was just another element of confusion. And so I think that's why the characters were not quite accurate. A homeschooling mom emailed me yesterday, and she was like, hey, can you let me know if the movie is true to the story? Because I don't want my kids, I don't want this to be their first introduction to the Odyssey if it's not true to the story. And so what I would say to that mom is, it's fairly true to the plot. If you're defining the story as plot, it's true to the plot in the sense that, like, yeah, he leaves Troy, he bounces around to different places, he has these adventures, and then he comes home. Like, the main plot points are there. But the way that this is not true to the story is because it gets the characters completely wrong. Absolutely wrong. And if you don't get that right, then you don't have the same story. The same thing I would say about Penelope. Um, Penelope, this was one of my biggest disappointments in the film. You know, I could deal with Matt Damon's bad acting, probably because I just love Matt Damon. Just love Matt Damon. But, you know, number one, I don't really care for Anne Hathaway personally. She did a great job acting in this movie, but Penelope is not Penelope in this movie. All her female, what would you call it? Her female charm, her femininity, her brilliance, her intelligence, her sense of dignity and refinement, her humility, her ability to stay in her lane as a woman in that culture and yet um, outwit the men. It's brilliant in the book. She is such a wonderful character and she's so unique. And she was not portrayed at all that way by Anne Hathaway. Um, you know, in the movie, Anne Hathaway is very angry, and I noticed this, not to get too feminist myself about this, but I don't, what is with this depiction of these women? Penelope was angry. Helen of Troy was angry. Clytemnestra was angry. Now, in the books, in Aeschylus, Clytemnestra is very angry, so that one was on point. But even the woman the woman formerly known as Ellen Page, who played a man in the movie because says she's now a man, even she was angry. So even the one who's like not even really a woman anymore in her own mind, but she was angry too. So like every woman in this story except for Clytemnestra. Oh, Circe was angry. Every woman except for Calypso was angry. And Calypso, because she wasn't angry, was just boring. So, you know, the female characters had no like, they were kind of interesting. I kind of appreciated what they did with Circe. I thought she was a very great actress, and that was actually one of my favorite parts of the story or of the movie. But you know, Penelope was never ambitious. She never wanted to be queen, and the way that she spoke to her son was just not accurate. And the main thing that they did in the movie is they kind of reversed something very important about Telemachus and Penelope. So in the book, Penelope believes that her husband is coming home, and it is her faith that allows her to sustain her trial and carry her cross, as we Christians would say, be, to the very end, because she has faith and hope. She has hope, I should say. She has hope that he's coming home. Telemachus does not have that same sense of hope. And in the story, Homer does a beautiful job of sort of creating a contrast there. And we see Penelope's hope as not a sign of naivete or gullibility or, you know, yeah, feminine naivete. We see it as a sign of her maturity as a person. Because she's more mature, she has hope. Whereas Telemachus, because he's still kind of a young man, he's not mature. He's very quick to say, oh, my dad's never coming home, and to dismiss that hope. He doesn't have hope. And that's one of my favorite things about Homer is that, you know, I think in our world, in our secular society, we see skepticism and nihilism as a sign of maturity, and only people who are young and naive have hope. And I love that about Homer because it's the mature woman who has hope, and it's her teenage acting son that's a little quick to give up. And in the movie, that's reversed. So Penelope is like angry and doesn't have a lot of hope. And Telemachus is the one who's like, no, like, we need to do this. We need to like find my dad, like he's out there somewhere or something like that. And Telemachus in the book is much more like a young person who is unsure and uncertain, and he doesn't have the hope that's often born from experience. And so anyway, they just reversed it, and I didn't think that they needed to do that. I could go on more about Telemachus and everything. Another thing that didn't make sense about Penelope, she's held out for 20 years, and if you she's held out for 20 years, and the minute that she's like asking everyone, is he still alive? Is he still alive? And she can never like really figure it out. So then she finally has a visitor who tells her he's alive. And she turns around and goes, that's it. I'm going to pick a new husband. It made no sense whatsoever. It's like, why the minute you get news to have hope, which is what you're looking for, the minute you get the news, you're going to give up and pick a new husband? Like, it made no sense. So there were some things like that that I was like, who in the world thought this was going to make sense? All right, and then the final thing that I did not like about the movie, or the weaknesses in the movie, are, I would say, the ending. But I was prepared for this. I called this years ago, years ago. I knew that Christopher Nolan would not get the ending right. And if you don't get the ending of the Odyssey right, then you don't get Homer. Okay. Yeah, like everyone always says, like Homer, the end of the Odyssey is that Odysseus gets home from the war and slaughters the suitors. That's not the end of the Odyssey. That's not the end. That's not the end. And the reason this bothers me so much is because the end is so brilliant and so important that how could you not get it right? I'm not going to tell you what the end is because then I would spoil it for you. You have to. Let's read the Odyssey. Let's read it together. But yeah, that's not the end. And the important thing about the ending of the Odyssey and why you should read the book, the epic poem, is because it sets up everything that happens later in Greek tragedy. So about, 200, 300 years passed between, sorry, more like, yeah, 300, 400 years passed between Homer and the great tragedians, Oedipus Rex, Agamemnon, all the great plays of the Greek tragedies that were written by the fathers of tragedy. The father of tragedy was Aeschylus, followed by Sophocles and Euripides, the great age of the Greek Enlightenment, the peak of their culture when they were performing these plays. They were performing Greek tragedy at religious festivals. So it was almost a ritual to perform these stories over and over and over, but different writers would have different treatments of the stories. And so it was very much tied up with religion. And Aeschylus, in particular, is asking some amazing religious questions. The central question of all religion, which I stole this from my one of my favorite priests, Father McCarthy. He says, the central question of all religion is, what kind of God is God if God exists? And what does God expect of me, if anything? That is a major question that Aeschylus is asking in his plays that are religious at their heart. And everything that happens in Greek tragedy is related to like the last 2 pages of the Odyssey. There is a direct connection, and I would say there is a direct connection with what is happening to this day. And so that's one of the most important reasons to read the book. It's all, I mean, I think it's like a lot of people say the end of the Odyssey was like kind of lame. Like my students even will be like, what was with the end? That was the worst ending ever. A lot of people think like maybe Homer was just getting kind of old and he just like punted. He's like, I'm tired of writing. I can't really think of a good ending. I'll just kind of phone it in. Some people are in that camp, but I'm more in the camp of like it's a lame ending for sure, but it's also a stroke of genius, and it's the only ending that makes sense. And so without understanding, the ending of the Odyssey, like if human history is a story and we haven't experienced the ending yet, I think the end of the Odyssey is tied to our ending, right? Like, time will eventually end. This world will go away. Where is everything leading? Everything they're dealing with in the last 2 pages of the Odyssey, we are dealing with right now. We are dealing with the war in Iran that's keeps stopping and then starting up again because they can't figure out how to end it, right? And where is that all stemming from? The introduction of the state of Israel in the Middle East, where'd that come from? World War II. Where'd that come from? World War I. Where'd World War I come from? It's anybody's guess. To this day, historians are still trying to figure out why people fought in World War One. I mean, yeah, the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand or whatever, that's always the story I got in school, but those same questions are being asked in the Odyssey and in the Iliad. Like my students ask that every year. Why are they fighting this war? This is a dumb war. Why are they fighting? And of course, there's the story that they're told, well, Paris stole Helen, so we have to go get her back. So we got to fight for 12 years. But my students are smart enough to know that that's not the only story. And in this story in the movie, they pay a nod to that. They do pay a nod to certain elements. You have Helen of Troy basically saying, it wasn't me. Don't, don't, don't let it, everyone wants to blame it on me, but they had their own reasons for doing this. I was just an excuse. So there are some interesting things about the movie, but when you read the book, I think the most important thing that you get out of it is like you see that these people were not that different from us. The people who wrote these stories, the people who believed in these crazy gods and the role of gods in human life, like they're not that different from us. They might be sort of different from your average secular humanist of today who approaches everything supernatural as skeptics and agnostics. But if you're a believer in God, and if you're a believer in the Christian God, you've got a lot in common with the characters in the Odyssey because they believed in God too, and they believed that the gods and the supernatural powers were working all the time to influence them, sometimes for good, sometimes for evil. And figuring out what the will of the gods was and doing it was very important. And as a Christian, we believe the same thing, but we just, of course, have a different idea of God. And we have a different answer to that question of who is God, um, and excuse me, and what does God expect of me, if anything? So we answer that question different, but it's still the same question. So anyway, a lot of that just, if you didn't get that supernatural element right, if you don't get the ending right, if you don't get the characters right, can you even really say that it's the Odyssey? It's the plot of the Odyssey, but it's not the Odyssey. And it's certainly not Odysseus, it's not Penelope, it's not Telemachus. Those are different characters that you'll see on screen. But now I'll just summarize real quickly what I did like about the movie. Number one, I thought the best parts of the movie were the most famous parts. With the Cyclops, with the Circe turning the men into pigs, with Scylla and Charybdis. I always forget how to say it. The whirlpool and the monsters, like the lotus flower, they did something kind of creative with that. But those parts when it's really fun to see someone bring those famous scenes to life on a big screen. And I loved the way that they did it actually. Those parts when they weren't talking and they weren't trying to be characters, but it was all about the spectacle of the just seeing it in front of your eyes. I thought they did a fantastic job and I thought it was really entertaining. Moreover, I very much appreciated that the way they made this movie was very like hands-on. I don't even know what the word is in the film world, but there's so much out there that's made with computers and I guess CGI or digital animation now that they do to enhance the effects. And I really loved and appreciated that it looked like there was a camera filming men on a real boat, on a real sea, on a real beach. And the monsters or the giants or they were not like CGI. They looked like big men in real costumes. And I even heard Matt Damon say, he said in his interview that like the Cyclops was like a big puppet. And so that all of that gave, when it comes to life, you could have done a lot with computers to make these fantastic, spectacular scenes that are so famous. But I appreciate the fact that they didn't do that. I loved that it felt real, even though like it was a movie. So I really applaud him for making a movie in kind of like the old-fashioned way because it just gives me, I don't know, I just loved it. I like the fact that I didn't believe there was any gratuitous violence, and there was no gratuitous sex either. This was shocking to me. I think there was one F word in the whole movie. There wasn't a lot of cursing. This is very unusual for a movie. And I would feel fairly confident saying you're probably okay letting your 14, 15, 16-year-old see this movie. Yes, there is a lot of violence, but honestly, compared to the violence in Homer, it's nothing. Like there's worse stuff in Homer, way worse stuff in terms of the level of violence and the violent acts and the way they're described. It's much worse in Homer. So compared to most of what's out there these days, the worst you're going to get is there is a scene in the when during the sacking of Troy when they show the soldiers like killing women. And at one scene, one moment, they kind of show what they could be like murdering an innocent child as a part of their rampage. But it's not like blood gushing everywhere. It's more of an impression of it than like let's show you up front this child getting killed or something. I actually thought it was pretty tame compared to like if you would let your student watch Hacksaw Ridge, this is nothing compared to that. So, and then also like I said, there was one bad word, but for the most part, the characters didn't curse, and there was no nudity, and there was no sex. And so 99% of Hollywood movies will throw in a sex scene just because, like, it's titillating or whatever, but they don't do that. There's one scene with Odysseus and Penelope, kind of a flashback when they're in bed together. And it's a very intimate scene, an intimate portrayal of a marriage, but it's not sexual. And when it does start to get a little heated, it changes scenes. So I really don't think that it would, I mean, me personally, I don't think that I would say it's inappropriate movie for 14 and up. What else did I like? That's pretty much it. I liked the music. I thought that there were some scenes that the music I thought was pretty cool. Some people thought it was overly done, but I liked it. I thought that the sound effects and the music really built up the suspense of the scenes. And like I said, the ending was, I won't tell you what the ending of the movie was. I thought it was pretty cliche. I wish they had done more with the real ending of the Odyssey. But honestly, if you don't know what to do with the supernatural element in the world of the story, if that's all over the map and you don't know what to do with it, I can understand why they didn't do the real ending. And I've only seen a few renditions of the Odyssey. Like there's a TV miniseries and other movies, but I have not stumbled across one yet that is faithful to the true ending, which I think is interesting. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Is there anything more? I don't think so. If you would like to read the Odyssey with me, I'd like to invite you to do that. My course does come with those lectures, and the study guide is really good. It includes writing assignments, discussion questions, creative projects, vocabulary, spiritual reflections to help you make connections with your faith. And so I think it's a good time. But you know what? You should really read the Iliad first. So if you want to buy both, you can do both. And each one would take you anywhere from, if you're really ambitious, maybe 6 weeks. But if you want to draw it out and take your time, maybe 12. So yeah, I hope that some of you will come study the Odyssey and the Iliad with me. There's a link in the comments below if you're seeing this on YouTube. But overall, would I recommend seeing the movie? Yeah, I'd say yeah, it's good enough. It's good enough to go see, but definitely don't let it be a substitute for the book because it's not the same characters. It's never going to get really the heart of those characters. And why not read the book and then you're set up to understand pretty much all of Greek tragedy that follows. And so just Homer is such a key to Western civilization and just human life in general that it's just, I want to give you that key because it'll help you unlock so many things and it'll help you connect with your cultural heritage and even our identity. So that's all I have for you. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.